Welcome back. I'm Terry Kramer, Faculty Director of the Easton Technology Management Center, and I'd like to say a special welcome to our third and final day of our Wilbur Wu Greater China Business Conference. Now, the conference today is going to be focused on the rapidly changing public policy environment and implications for technology companies. Specifically, we've got three goals for the sessions today. The first is to get a state of the affairs regarding changes in the regulatory environment in the Greater China region. The second goal is to look at which companies and sectors are most affected and why. And the third goal is to obtain insights for technology companies regarding actions they should be taking to ensure a constructive regulatory environment. Now, in our first session, we're going to have Ambassador David Gross provide us a 360-degree view of the state of technology today. He'll discuss the rapidly changing public policy environment globally and its implications for the technology sector and innovation. Key topics are going to include emerging areas of public policy across the world, including antitrust, data privacy, and the role of government amidst a growing penetration of technology-based products and services, including social networks. He's going to address the key forces shaping China's digital ecosystem and share learnings from the region that impact the rest of the world and his predictions on opportunities and challenges ahead. The second session will focus on the Greater China region's unique context. Panelists are going to be discussing the major forces and key enablers, especially public policy, that have helped contribute to the shaping of innovation in the region. So let me now start with the first session of the day. And I'd like to start with some important context here, the focus of our discussion, and also talk to you about the background of our very impressive speaker. During the pandemic, technology played an incredible role keeping us all connected and moving. Innovation continued to drive all areas of our lives: work, commerce, education, entertainment, healthcare, social networks, and transportation. In some parts of the world, technology was used to record an individual's travel history, residence, and medical records to allow effective contact tracing. AI improved the efficiency of PCR tests to provide countries with faster and better test processes. Zoom, Microsoft, Google, Cisco, and other technology companies created solutions to foster remote, real-time communication, reducing the need for face-to-face interaction. Global e-commerce jumped to $26.7 trillion in 2020, with companies such as Alibaba and Amazon experiencing significant growth. User time on social platforms increased 44%, and all social platforms saw monthly active users rise consistently during the past 2 years, ranging from 8% growth at Twitter to 38% growth with TikTok. Entertainment has continued to flourish as the number of streaming solutions has passed 1 billion globally in 2020. The combination of technology and COVID have created a definitive change in place, shifting where we shop, where we work, where we're entertained, and much more. Along with these seismic changes, governments are taking notice and taking action. The so-called techlash is emerging rapidly across almost every area of technology advancement. China passed its first ever sweeping legislation on consumer data privacy, the Personal Information Protection Law, in November of last year. This is modeled around Europe's groundbreaking General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, which went into effect about 5 years ago. The European Union has also taken more stringent steps in the past few months with the Digital Markets Act, a proposal aimed to curb big tech's power even more by creating limits on competitive market advantage for companies with a market cap of at least 75 billion euros. Antitrust concerns are alive and well in China, whose recent regulations aimed at its own homegrown tech companies have wiped off about $1 trillion of market value from these Chinese shares listed globally. Those affected included a wide range of industries from e-commerce to private tutoring, data security, and online content. Companies that suffered during this crackdown included the world's biggest, Tencent, Alibaba, Didi, Meituan, with shares falling from single to double-digit percentages. Across the Pacific, the U.S. has also been increasingly scrutinizing its own tech companies, such as Meta, Google, and Amazon. The government has created multiple hearings to hold these tech companies' feet to the fire and initiated many investigations and legal action. Perhaps the most illuminating sign of a change in attitude towards big tech came at the tail end of 2020, when Section 230, a legislative clause that has historically protected companies such as Meta from facing accountability from content published on its platform, was called into question by the Justice Department between January 2021 and March 2022. Lawmakers introduced more than 20 revision proposals to the clause. The growth potential of tech is increasingly linked with regulation and government oversight everywhere, and the need for collaboration and understanding is crucial for continued benefits that technology can provide. Now, with that context, I'd like to introduce our esteemed guest, Ambassador David Gross, who we are excited to have as our keynote speaker today. We will get his perspective on the latest developments in public policy as related to technology on a global basis, what companies can do to mitigate unfavorable regulation, and how technology companies should proceed in the most beneficial way. Ambassador Gross is widely recognized as one of the world's foremost experts on international telecommunications and the internet. He draws on more than 30 years of experience across a wide range of positions in industry and public service. He served as the Washington Counsel for AirTouch Communications from 1994 to 2000, and then was appointed as U.S. Ambassador and U.S. Coordinator for International Communications and Information Policy at the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Economic and Business Affairs from 2001 to 2009. There, he was responsible for the formulation and advocacy of international communications policies for the United States. He's currently a partner at Wiley Rein in Washington, D.C., where he advises U.S. companies on international business expansion. He's also a board member of numerous major nonprofit organizations and has lectured on a broad set of technology and internet issues at major universities around the world. He advises companies and many others who are investing in, monitoring, and seeking to understand the U.S. and international markets, including developments at the International Telecommunications Union, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, as well as elsewhere. Now, in terms of the format, like our other sessions, I'll ask Ambassador Gross a series of questions to help glean his insights, and then we'll go to audience questions. We'll use the Slido platform for audience questions. You'll see Slido embedded at the bottom of your screen. You can either enter in one of your own questions or upvote one of the existing questions. Let me now turn it over and say a big welcome to Ambassador David Gross.
Well, thank you very much, Terry. It's great to be with you. Wish we were all together in person, of course, particularly if we could do it either in LA, Hong Kong, or Beijing, three of my favorite places. But it's great to be with you and to spend, in my case, a Friday evening with you. And I know for many of our guests, it's actually Saturday morning. So I appreciate everyone getting up and working with me on a Saturday morning.
Well, we appreciate you spending your Friday evening with us. So if I may ask you to begin with, Ambassador Gross, give us the broad landscape here. Give us the state of affairs as you look across the world and look at all the different public policy issues. What are you seeing? What is most noticeable?
Well, you know, there are a lot of things that are going on, which is almost always the case. You know, I think this to start off with, what I have found over the years is that although there are a number of global trends, which I'll talk about in a moment, that drive much of what is going on, particularly from a global regulatory perspective. At its base, most regulations, most laws are really local. And so although I'm going to talk about some of these global phenomenon, it is always important to focus really on the particular issues, challenges, and uniqueness that comes with every country and every region. So many I have found over the years, many people sort of just keep an eye on the big picture and fail to realize that all politics is really local, as people have said in the past. And that's true from a regulatory perspective as well. Now, having said that, there are obviously a couple of very large global phenomenon happening. And I'm old enough to have seen this movie a couple of times. So one of the things I'm always struck by is how these things cycle. There's very little that's truly new. It is, in fact, usually trying to understand what is old that really helps you understand how to grapple with these issues. So I think today, if we were talking about these things as we are, there are really two primary drivers of regulation with regard to technology. One is the issue of globalization. Many are now talking about a decoupling of the global economy. I think that overstates it, but it does make the point that we are in a process that is very different than the prior couple of decades, where much of the regulatory environment for technology and for many other things was done to encourage trade. And we got, as a world, tremendous benefits across the board. It's really hard to find an area or a country that did not benefit from the great globalization that happened after World War II, and really particularly in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, and the first decade of this century. That, by the way, is in great contrast. This was not the first time that we have had globalization and the impact on technology. In the late 19th century, up until World War I, new technologies, including the telephone, ocean transport, and the like, really drove the first wave of true globalization. And it was World War I that put that to a stop, and it really didn't recover at all until after World War II. So these things go in cycles, and we can talk more about that in a moment. But it's clearly globalization, and now some retrenchment from globalization. The concern that is you hear in almost every capital, Beijing, Washington, Brussels, it doesn't matter. You hear the same things: the need for greater self-sufficiency, the need to control the economy in a way that also is sensitive to national security interests and the like. And as I say, these pendulums, these cycles, they change over time. I think many people overstate it, but I think you were going to truly decouple. I don't think that ends up being in anybody's interest, but clearly we are in a process now and have been for the past few years of having less globalization as a driver for advancement, and certainly in terms of regulation of technology. Mm-hmm. The second part, go ahead. I would say the second major driver with regard to technology globally is a concern now about market power, and as part of that market power, the social impact that technology, particularly the platform companies and the like, are having, but it's not at all exclusive to platform companies. And again, we see this in every part of the world. You see it in Washington, you see it in Beijing, you hear about it in Brussels. Every capital is focusing on this. In contrast to, I would say, the 1990s, when the internet was really in the rise, and the first really 2 decades of this century, where you really didn't hear very much. Technology was the answer, not the problem. And that was widely viewed. And the internet was a huge driver for that. And obviously, starting around, one can say around 2016 or so, 15, 16, that started to change pretty dramatically. And we've seen that change spread around the world, where governments and societies are increasingly worried about market power, that is the ability of these tech companies to be able to control prices, information, a variety of things, and the social impact, the adverse sometimes social impact. So the shift from the benefits of technology, which drove the 1980s, 90s, and the first decade of this century, shifted probably as fast as I've seen anything shift in terms of public policy to being one of great concern globally. So I would say those are two major global drivers of regulatory policies that I imagine is going to continue to drive decision making for the next few years.
Fascinating. So basically what you're saying is technology-based services are, number one, getting penetrated in the market very rapidly, all the things that Eric Schmidt has kind of highlighted in his own comments. And then you're saying it's that coupled with increasing concerns about market power, about social impact, and this kind of convergence of feeling that globalization's gone a bit too far. And that's kind of set the landscape here.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that is a concern. Now, as is true for many things in the public policies, they're often overstated. Things are viewed sort of as black or white, which in my experience is almost never the case. But there is no doubt that technology is viewed fundamentally differently today by policymakers than it was even a decade or so ago. And where a decade, for the couple of decades before, let's say, 2015, 2016, it was viewed in most capitals as a huge benefit, and that there was need to shepherd that benefit in some fashion. Now you hear much less about the benefits and much more about the costs and problems.
Yeah, and Ambassador, why has this happened so quickly and in such a pronounced way? When you think about it, and I obviously gave the context here, during COVID, technology allowed us to kind of carry on with our lives and remote working and telehealth and all these quote unquote good things. And yet there's been a kind of harsh shift in position. Was there some bad behavior on certain companies? Is there politics at work? Why the rapid notable shift as opposed to kind of an evolution of change in policy?
Well, I think it's really hard to know, and frankly, it takes more time in terms of time distance from these events to really understand them. This is why I love reading history, because things become much clearer when you have a couple of hundred years to look back than it is when you're in the middle of the maelstrom. But having said that, I do think there are a couple of things that are lessons. One, and I put myself in this category very much, I think the promise of technology was oversold. It looked to many, and I put myself in this category, that technology was going to fundamentally change many things that were of great importance. And it did, and has, and continues to have huge global benefits. The number of people arising, out of extreme poverty and out of poverty have been historic over the past few years. The benefits that come from connectivity, so that people have access to the world's knowledge, where before, up until recently, that was impossible for most of the world. Only the rich, only those who lived in cities had access to the world, the knowledge of the world. That's no longer the case. And so there are a few things that are extraordinarily important and extraordinarily different. Having said that, I think many of us thought that the scope of how technology would impact politics, society, economics would be a more fundamental change than is the case. And we should have known better, because history is full of examples of where people think it's going to be different this time, and it's rarely different this time. So you put that together with the fact that there really are some, if not unique problems, at least unanticipated problems from technology. There are social issues about the way in which information is disseminated. There are tremendous benefits, and I am personally a huge proponent of the free flow of information. But I also recognize that there is misinformation, disinformation, that the ability of people to understand what is real and what is not real takes some real sophistication, and that is a hard process. And most people are not prepared for that. That's not a criticism of individuals. It's a criticism perhaps of all of our societies, that we're not better at that, but we're not particularly good at it. And so we see the societal impacts that are really felt pretty globally. And you see governments scrambling to try to figure out how to make that problem better. And it's not easy.
And has the US, we had a speaker last night talking about fintech and made some very interesting comments about cultural differences between the greater China region and the US. And nicely, very respectfully said, the US has been very active in kind of putting out vision. Technologists, evangelize, and they're putting out vision. And there's been more of a focus on execution in China. Is this kind of idea of technology being oversold especially a problem coming from the US and that's kind of permeated the world, or not?
Well, I think it's slightly different. I'm not disagreeing with it. I think a lot of these things, we have to always be careful. It's much safer to sort of look at particular facets of technology and analyze how it is developed and how it's being used and what the ripple effects of it are, as compared to talking about technology writ large, which is sort of what I'm doing right now, which by definition is very dangerous to do, because there are always lots of examples that run counter to the sense that I'm trying to project about the way things are. But I do think one of the things in the United States, we are extraordinarily good, I think, at innovation. That's been one of our comparative advantages globally. We're very good at innovation because we are very good at capital formation. We're very good because we have a lot of freedom to fail. We're very good at innovation because we have a very sophisticated university system. And we have a culture that promotes experimentation and does not penalize failure, generally speaking. And that's an unusual set of characteristics globally. It's not true in many places in Europe or Asia, where the social dynamics and the culture and the history are different. One's not better, one's not worse, it's just different. Now, having said that, one of the characteristics I have always been very impressed with regard to Greater China is how very good the economy has been to date at the application side. And by applications, I mean using it, taking the technology and bringing it to a very large audience and getting that large audience to adopt it. And there are a lot of reasons. Part of it is the ability, if you didn't have something that was similar before, the ability to sort of leapfrog it can be very, very powerful. And I think the greater Chinese economies have been extraordinarily good and successful at that. That's not to say they haven't also been very successful in developing new technologies as well. But I think in terms of where I've been particularly impressed has been in that area. And we'll see if that will be able to continue. As you point out, there are some structural changes that are being driven by Beijing. And it's obviously too early to know. In fact, some of those structural changes are changing again, even in the past few days, where we see some refinement to some of what had been going on for the past year or two. So as we get closer to the Congress later this year, we'll see how these things develop.
So let me now, Ambassador, drill down on specific areas. And I've got in my mind, as well as on a piece of paper in front of me, a 3x3 matrix. And across the top are the major regions of the world. So the US, Europe, and China. And down the left side of the column, I've got three major public policy issues: data privacy, antitrust, and social networks. And I want to get a sense of what you see across the globe with those different public policy areas of focus. And I'd like to start actually on antitrust, because you've already started to bring that up. And if you would give us the deeper look at antitrust, the Digital Markets Act just came out recently, and tell us what you're seeing in antitrust.
Well, it is interesting. And let me just mention, and I won't dwell on it at all. I really like your three buckets because those are three very large sets of economies that drive much of what we're talking about. But from where I sat for many years, I want to also recognize that that's not exclusive. And I know you weren't intending it to be exclusive, but much of the impact of what we're talking about is really felt in Africa, elsewhere in the Americas, in South Asia, and the like. And it is important to keep that in mind because the policy decisions that are made in Beijing, Brussels, Washington have huge ripple effects on these other regions. And the regions understand that very well. And they have their own history, their own culture, their own backgrounds that need to be taken into account. So it makes it even more complicated if that's possible. But looking at the three areas that geographic areas you're talking about, in antitrust, it's really very fascinating to me. So we have a lot of commonality. Up until fairly recently, I would say that in the United States, there was some hand-wringing about competition, antitrust, and the size. But it was primarily a lot of academic hand-wringing and the like, not a lot from individuals. And that was driven by a couple of things. One is that the companies, the big tech companies, have been very successful in bringing things of great value to people for free or virtually free. And that's a very appealing price for almost every individual. And so although competitors were often complaining about the network effects and their inability to compete with the major players, the FANGs and the like, nevertheless, up until fairly recently, it didn't get a lot of attention overall because the benefits seemed to be so substantial. And the technology itself kept changing. If you look at internet browsers, for example, the original internet browsers aren't with us anymore. They keep getting replaced. The Microsoft antitrust case, which was a huge antitrust case, was all about things that nobody cares about anymore. And so there is a sense that antitrust law in the United States is not a very effective tool to deal with the problems we're starting to see now because it takes so long, there's so much process, and it's often very backward-looking rather than forward-looking. And so in the United States, we are hearing a lot more about antitrust. This administration, the Biden administration, has expressed a very aggressive view with regard to tech. Tech is, as you pointed out, by and large, with some exceptions, but by and large, not a politically favored group anymore in a dramatic fashion. And so you start to see these issues. And in the United States, you see probably its most notable impact, I think, right now, is that it is very hard for the very large, very experienced tech companies to be able to acquire new companies very easily, which they were doing for many years, because the view is they were trying to acquire, and this is right or wrong, I'm not expressing an opinion, about that they were acquiring their potential competitors, the new entrants that could compete with them, and that was wrong. And so I think this administration has expressed the view that it was a mistake to allow some of those acquisitions to take place. So we'll see what happens. Europe is different. Europe has been very aggressive with regard to regulation from a competition law perspective. Many in the United States have thought that was sort of sour grapes, as we call it, because there are virtually no large high-tech companies in Europe, sort of surprisingly, and the few that have emerged often get bought out by somebody else. And so there was a sense that this was more protectionistic than real. Perhaps more specifically, however, the antitrust in the United States is designed, very purposely designed to protect consumers, which is why the zero price is a hard thing to prove that's a problem. Europe has a different view on competition law, where they really look very much at the effect on competition and competitors. And that is probably an easier case to make, particularly with large network-based companies, because it can, of course, have an adverse impact on competitors, even if it's actually benefiting consumers. One of the facts, for example, is that Europe has been going after Google for many, many years now with fines and so forth. But yet in Europe, Google has a higher percentage of use rate than even in the United States. So the people of Europe use Google more on average than the people in the United States use Google. And yet Google is being attacked by Brussels for competition, and understandably so, in the sense that in their way they view things that make some sense. China, on the other hand, is especially fascinating. It is fascinating to me in part because of the speed in which decisions are made. And not only changing the view, but also the speed for which this happens. Where in the United States, these things have to develop very slowly because of our legal structure and the like, and how difficult it is to make new laws and new regulations, and the court review process and the like. Where in China, it is interesting to watch how quickly new policies get rolled out and how dramatic the impact on major providers of technology and major providers of technical services that are major global players have been affected. So the competition is clearly, competition law, antitrust is clearly affecting everybody in those three large markets, and increasingly so. I will also say that Europe and the United States right now, our governments are coordinating much more actively on competition and antitrust related issues with regard to tech. And that's true from a regulatory perspective as well. Whether or not that will be successful, either in Europe or in the United States, we will see. And we don't see the same sort of coordination going on between Europe and the United States and China right now.
Yeah, let me drill down a little bit on the antitrust piece here. As you know, there's been a lot of work that's gone on in a variety of U.S. universities about increasing returns to scale of large technology companies. Actually, that the quality of what they offer gets better with more scale. Relevance in Google search would be an example of it. Also, the ability to use those insights to move across boundaries to enter other sectors. Google going into transportation, Amazon going into healthcare, et cetera, with better insights along the way. Is there a risk here actually that all of the antitrust efforts may actually hurt consumers because of an inability to kind of acknowledge the dynamics in technology businesses that tend to be highly scale oriented?
Yeah, I think there's no doubt. And this has been the policy debate in the United States now for a good number of years. That is, I think it's almost self-evident that there are tremendous benefits that come from scale and scope in the tech area. It's the network effects issue and so forth, and we see it. We also recognize that there are potential downsides, which is what many policymakers are really focusing on on today, because with that comes increased market power and the ability to control. And if you don't have, under sort of U.S. legal regime, if you don't have an effectively competitive market, then the alternative is regulation, because then the idea is you then have to regulate. This was the old AT&T problem in the United States, and it was true globally. Up until the late 1970s, early 80s, it was viewed that telephone companies were naturally monopolies. There were natural monopolies because of the network effects, and that you ought not to have multiple players, that it was a waste of society's resources. Everyone can benefit. The trade-off was that telephone companies needed to be regulated. In most countries, it was actually government-owned. In the United States, it was regulated by a commission, and the rates were regulated, the terms and conditions were regulated. Then in the 1980s, we broke up AT&T, largely because the technologies had started to change, and the possibility of competition, even in that market, started to become clearer. And as long as you had interconnections so that the network effects became, could be shared in some fashion, The view was that competition would increase, which it certainly did, particularly with the advent of wireless, and that the need for regulation became correspondingly less, which certainly seemed to be the case, and the ability to innovate became much, much greater. So we saw that in the United States, and then soon thereafter, we saw that become a great global phenomenon, where you had multiple providers of communication services. You had auctions for spectrum, which governments like because they make money from it. And you saw great competition, great innovation, and great benefits for consumers. And that was a global phenomenon, unlike any others we had ever seen before. And the benefits were tremendous. So the key is to try to figure out, can you get sufficient competition in that space that allows and drives innovation, lower prices, greater quality overall, or do you need to regulate in some fashion? And here, I think it's really important to sort of step back and say, technology is not all the same. We all know that. There are aspects that may well be natural monopolies associated with it, and there are areas that clearly are not. And thinking about these things more carefully become important. And usually in those discussions, market definitions become very important. So Amazon is very large and is an important part of many of our lives, but it competes not only with other internet-based companies, but stores in my neighborhood, other big stores, that are a few miles away. There's a lot of competition in that space. So again, do you define the market as being just internet related, or do you define the market as being when I want to buy a battery, and what are my choices to buy a battery or some cereal or whatever it is I'm in the market for? Those are difficult questions to answer, but very important for that analysis. I would also point out the other part to your question, I think, looking ahead is, and I know you're about to raise the issue of privacy because you mentioned it a moment ago, is, why is there the discomfort with these large companies? And part of it is a sense of discomfort that they know too much about us, that there is a lack of privacy that comes. Now, I will confess to you that I am in a very small minority. My view is that actually policymakers make too much of the privacy issues. And I say that because although if you're doing polling, which of course happens all the time, almost everyone, and I would include myself in this, will tell you that privacy is a very important part of my life. I don't want people who I don't know to know too much about me. And that's a starting off place. But if I watch what people actually do, and by people I mean myself included, I don't control my privacy very well. I get messages every single time I go on a website asking about cookies, asking about whether or not what type of privacy I want to choose for myself. What settings will I have on my devices? And I, like virtually everybody else, almost get annoyed with those notices. I just want the information. I want the goods. I want to get to where I want to go as quickly and as easily as possible. And even more so, I don't like ads about things I don't care about, but I do sometimes I'm interested in ads about things I'm trying to decide about because I get information from those ads, whether it's about pricing or about new services or about whatever it is that I might be thinking about. So in fact, although I would say to a survey, I care a lot about privacy, and everybody else I think would say the same thing. My experience is most people say they care and they don't really care when it comes down to it. So the privacy piece is a two-edged sword. It's, information about individuals is really important for new and innovative services on the internet. On the other hand, it clearly makes people very uncomfortable.
Yeah. And say more on this, Ambassador, about the data privacy laws we're seeing. So PIPL in China, GDPR you started to allude to, CCPA in the US, et cetera. What is your view on the different policies that are being promoted?
Yeah, and I think, let me start. We all start with the proposition that, as I said, privacy is important. And in Europe, they would say it's a human right. I'm never quite sure I understand what the Europeans mean by human rights because they've got so many of them, but they say that's a human right. So therefore it's clearly important. You know, each one is trying to figure out how to put consumers in control of their data in some fashion. And almost everyone agrees that's a good way of thinking about these things. How you do that effectively and what information do consumers need to know? How much time do consumers need to take to deal with these things gets to be very problematic. I will also say, as a former policymaker, one of the things I look at on these things is what impact is it going to have on new technologies? And by that, there's a lot of ways you could talk about that, but probably one of the ones that's most in the news is artificial intelligence, AI. If you talk to the experts on AI, they all tell you sort of a similar thing, which is in order to have machine learning, but particularly to really look at some of the things that are so exciting about potentially AI, and there's lots of different things in AI. It's a very imprecise term, of course. You need a lot of data, and people create a lot of data. And so if you're going to do research and develop really great AI systems, you need to have access to a lot of data that people produce. The ability to get access to that may be an unintended consequence and a problem if privacy laws are made too strict. And, you know, because AI promises to be hugely transformative for and beneficial for societies and individuals, we want to make sure, I think, with certain obviously regulations and concerns, that AI is allowed to continue to develop. I think in China, because of the way they have worked on these things, they actually do have access through their privacy law allows for that sort of access. Obviously, there's been a lot of focus on things where government, the Chinese government can have access to information that others are not as pleased about, but that piece of it can be, I think, potentially very interesting and helpful for the Chinese as they develop AI systems. The US has been sort of trying to feel its way through that process. We have one of the great failures, I think almost everybody would agree, is the failure in the United States to have a nationwide set of rules in this area. We've had rules for many, many years, but they've been very sector specific. Healthcare, for example, financial services, but not an overarching set of rules that would apply to everyone. So our states, smaller localities, are establishing these rules, which create problems when you have a nationwide economy and you have players trying to operate not only nationwide but internationally as well. So it becomes a bit of a trap for the unwary, and so that becomes a problem. Europe, I think, has been very, as you pointed out, GDPR, which has been a big success as defined by how well accepted it's been globally, and it clearly has been a real leader in that area. But I'm not at all convinced that that turns out in the long run to be the effective way. What I hear from the people who know much more about artificial intelligence research and the like than I know, which is virtually everybody in the AI area, that Europe is way behind. And part of it is they can't get access easily to human-created data because of all the restrictions. And so that may be a real problem as they continue to develop in this area, recognizing that there are a lot of advantages to having control. So I'm not trying to say one is necessarily right or wrong, but as you develop in these areas, it becomes very important to think not only about the current state of affairs, but what impact it's going to have on future innovation and development of new technologies, which is always hard to figure out.
Excellent. Let me ask you two last questions. First one is I want to talk about social networks specifically, because obviously that's generated a huge amount of angst here in the US. The rest of the world is kind of looking at issues of misinformation, disinformation. You've highlighted in your opening comments, et cetera. What is your view about, policies and regulation on social networks regarding Section 230 here in the US, ways to have content moderation occur?
Yeah, so this is a hugely complicated and difficult area. And so I have great sympathy across the board for everyone dealing with this. I think everyone would like to see social media be a source of truthful and accurate information, a place that is welcoming to a variety of opinions, that is less intense and less hateful in some respects, more socially beneficial. How you do this, however, is, I think, maybe at the end of the day, a bridge too far. And the reason I think it may end up being a bridge too far, which is, I realize, somewhat of a depressing thought, is because people are very difficult. I mean, if we were just purely logical, reasonable people, and we were all that way, we wouldn't have wars, we wouldn't have a lot of things that are really very problematic. And, in social networking, it seems to be driven by a very small number of people, even on places like Twitter and so forth. The numbers of it doesn't represent at all on any side a substantial number of the US population, no less the global population. And so it's driven by, a small minority of people who seem to have nothing better to do with their time than to do a lot of stuff on Twitter. And in fact, one of the areas where you might see some benefit is, I am told that, a lot of the stuff you see on social networks is actually not human created. They're bots that are out there that do this stuff. And there may well be some effective ways of using technology to determine whether or not there's actually an individual behind it. Now, having said that, you would think, well, the easy way is only authenticate individuals and let them on. And you have to authenticate by proving that you are a person. That gets a little complicated because one of the major longtime policy views of the United States, and I would say of much of Europe as well, has been to allow for a very expansive political debate. And if you tell people they have to identify themselves as part of that debate, many people will find that they won't speak because they don't want the repercussions either from governments or from their community or from others who might well take offense at whatever it is that people are saying. So it can be a very difficult thing from a policy perspective to figure out how to do that. I know there's a tremendous amount of resources being developed by platform companies, both in terms of technology, the number of individuals. I know that's true in China and elsewhere. It's a very difficult process.
Yeah. Let me ask the last question before we go to the audience questions here. And what I'm going to try and do is say, listen, if you wanted to pick the best of kind of perspectives from different parts of the world on these policy issues, let me put forward what that might be and let you debate that. Let me start with the first one on social networks that you just raised and basically say, listen, China is looking at what's going on in the US and saying, what a mess on your social networks. The amount of divisiveness and lack of kind of honesty and alignment around what's best for society. And China's mindset, without getting all the policy issues, is the right one, that something's got to change there. On data privacy issues, let's assume that Europe has got the right view that says, hey, listen, we've got to be super thoughtful as there's more and more information out there. We've been too lax kind of letting stuff happen, and we give them the check mark for advancing data privacy rules. And on the antitrust side, we say, listen, the US companies have fairly acknowledged that they've helped consumers mostly with their scale. They've acknowledged increasing returns to scale, and that the US mindset, the kind of default view, is to kind of allow that scale to happen until you can clearly prove there's harm to the end user, that the US gets a check mark in that. What is your reaction if we kind of had to give each region a first place mark on their policy stance?
Well, I love the idea of giving everybody high grades. That's always a good thing. But I think that if I may suggest, there's a different way of thinking about these things. Mm-hmm. And it goes back to something I said at the very beginning, which is everything, if it's going to be effective, it has to be local and locally based and reflect the culture, the history, the values in a country, in a region. And now there are some global values, and they're relatively easy to state. I mean, the UN has, the Charter has some of them. The UN, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has some of them. We have some generalized statements. But at the end of the day, it's really how they're implemented and how they're viewed that becomes important. And so in answering your question of who's got the best, I think it's really important that everyone watch what everybody else is doing, because nobody, and everyone agrees with this, nobody's figured this out. And everyone is feeling their way through. And it'll always be that way. As technology changes, as economies change, as relationships between countries change and regions change, these things have to change as well. And so it'll always be dynamic. It'll never be static. But we are not headed to a world, I believe, where one size fits all, and in any of these areas. And so I think what you have to do as policymakers and as advocates from a company perspective and others, civil society, is to try to look and identify what seems to work best globally, and why that's true, and is it and can it be effective in another area, another region, and with almost always with some customization. So having said that, the other piece I think associated with that is it is fascinating to watch as we talk about globalization and as some people call it, decoupalization, but it really is perhaps somewhat of a retrenchment from the hyper globalization that we've had up for the past few years, up until a couple of years ago. As we see that happening, we will have to watch and see how regions react. So, for example, we see there's a very conscious effort right now between Europe and the United States to figure out ways to better integrate our economies, including the tech area. So there's what's called the TTC, which is a high-level group of government officials from Brussels and Washington who are charged with trying to figure out, with a bunch of 10 different subgroups, working groups, how to figure out how to harmonize as best they can the regulations in their process to help facilitate trade in goods and services in the tech area. Other regions are obviously trying to do the same thing and thinking about these things. And how that develops will become very important. So in essence, it'll be, is China going to be its own region with its own set of rules and regulations and approaches because it's the uniqueness of China? Or will it try to figure out how to integrate with Europe and the United States the way we were doing a few years ago, more actively? And where does that leave India, Africa, the Middle East, other large markets and large regions that use technology and demand a place at the table to figure out what's going on in these areas, because they're clearly dramatically affected by the decisions made in Beijing, Brussels, and in Washington.
Yep, makes sense. So, Ambassador, we got a lot of questions. Let me start taking them. I'm going to pose the most popular ones first, work our way down. William Wong, first question here. How should investors view and navigate the rapidity of regulatory decisions in China recently? Is basically China going to be a difficult place to invest in for the short to intermediate term because of the rapid changes here? Or no, this is a long game and this is going to be a good outcome long term?
Well, two disclaimers and then I'll answer the question. One disclaimer is I know enough to be dangerous, but I'm not a real China expert. There are people who are much, much more knowledgeable about that issue from a Chinese perspective than I am. And the second is I certainly am not in a position to give any investment advice. Having said those two things, I think the way to analyze what is happening in China is trying to understand what it is that the government and President Xi is doing and why they're doing it, and the pressures to continue to do that. So, President Xi is very clear and has been very explicit, and I think we'll see more of that as we go getting closer to the Congress later this year, that what it is they're trying to do. They're trying to ensure that the economy, including the big companies, tech companies, are doing what should be done in service to the CCP, to the Chinese Communist Party. And that's that's their responsibility. And so trying to figure out whether or not they will get more regulated, less regulated. As I said, clearly there are some recent changes, some mid-course corrections perhaps going on, is trying to understand what is it that Beijing is thinking about in that sense. And that will be, which is a different set of issues than if I'm trying to give the same set of advice about American companies or European companies operating in Europe and the United States. So that will be the other piece. I would say is that recent political things that are going on globally, probably at the margin, at least, if not more, will make it increasingly hard for Chinese companies to get some significant market presence, if they don't already have it, in economies in the United States and in Europe.
Interesting. Good. Very helpful. Very helpful. Next question. This one comes from Melvin. With the recent global politics specifically related to alliances right now between China and Russia versus Western countries, will that hinder tech advances and collaboration? How will that affect all the other countries that aren't part of those alliances?
I think the simple answer is yes. What we're seeing is, and alliances is fascinating. I'm so pleased that it brought that up. As you analyze China, one of the things you're struck by is the advantages China brings to the party, which is it's the world's largest country in terms of population. It either is or may well soon be the world's largest economy. Those are huge, huge advantages. But they have a deep trading relationship with many, many governments around the world, many countries, many economies around the world. But you're hard pressed to answer the question, who are China's allies? And it's pretty easy. If you ask who are the United States' allies, it's a pretty substantial list. And governments are very proud of being aligned with the United States as in calling themselves an ally. And I don't mean just from a military perspective or otherwise, from an economic perspective and from a political perspective and from a cultural perspective. And the same with Europe. The same thing is true with Russia. Now, Russia has the CIS countries traditionally, and particularly now probably with some of the stands, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and so forth. But again, it doesn't have a very substantial list of countries that it would consider allies. And I think in terms of current events, you see that very starkly right now. And there's a whole reevaluation that is really very dramatic as a result of what's been going on since February 24th. And so we'll have that. I think it means, having said all that, we were already before February 24th seeing a shift in the way in which Chinese companies were able to do business in Europe and the United States, and frankly, the way in which US companies were able to make investments and do business in China and elsewhere. Whether or not that changes in the next short to medium term is hard to know. My sense is that it may well change in some respects because the Chinese economy is so closely tied to the US and European economies. They're so integrated that even if there are political, and there clearly are political and other reasons why China is being very careful with regard to the current events and the way they speak of it, and there's some very deep reasons for that. Nevertheless, that could well change, and it wouldn't surprise me, but it might not. But the national security piece, we talked about that whole supply chain piece at the beginning. I think that's going to continue to fragment. And again, often overstated, but it will continue to fragment. And I think in the tech space, it's going to be where it is most fragmented. It's going to be increasingly hard for companies to be able to do cutting edge high-tech business in the US, Europe, and China all at the same time.
Fascinating. Good. Another question from David Tan. How will laws evolve regarding the sharing of data versus allowing autonomy in areas like healthcare, security? How will they differ in China versus other parts of the world? So in essence, and I'm putting my own spin on this, in areas like healthcare, where you need lots of data to get medical research advances to improve healthcare outcomes and reduce costs, in areas like that, is China going to outpace markets like the US and Europe that are being more strict on data sharing?
Yeah, I think I'm not trying to dodge the question. I think it's an excellent question. I really don't know, and I don't think it's knowable right now. So, but what do I know? Or at least what I think I know. It may well be that China is going to do very well in that space, not only because it's got such a large population, domestic population, but also, as I mentioned before, one of the things I'm always impressed by is how quickly China can change its rules and regulations. Now, that can be a problem, of course, if you're making investments based on the way the rules currently are. They can change very quickly. But for good or for bad, the way in which they can change is much faster than in the United States or in Europe. And so my guess is that they will continue to look at that set of rules and try to answer the question, are those rules in China letting us do the things we think are important for China to be able to do and to benefit the Chinese people, the Chinese government, and the country overall? And so if it's not working, my sense is they can and will change it. Where in the United States and Europe, it is painfully long and difficult to make the changes, as we've seen by the failure of the United States right now to have a unified national privacy policy. In Europe, which has one, but it's not at all clear, how well it's going to work going forward.
Yep. Good. Let me ask you, there are two questions that are somewhat related. Eddie Zhang says, one of our speakers yesterday mentioned the importance of global standards. How do you see the need and ability for countries and companies to set these standards? And then a related one, what do you predict, this is from Charles, what do you predict will bring back globalization so that you have partnering between China and the US? Will it be politics? Will it be technological opportunities, trade agreements, et cetera? How important are these global standards? And if it is all important, how do you get everything kind of back together again?
Actually, it's a wonderful question because it brings back fond memories for me, or at least interesting memories. So I happen to think global standards that are driven by industry and innovators as compared to governments are extraordinarily important. It lowers the costs. It allows for innovation. It allows for connectivity and the interexchange of technologies that really have been extraordinarily important globally. The reason I smile in part is, China for a long time, including when I was at the State Department, had liked some international standards, but really, really liked having its domestic standards. And part of the reason they liked it is they said, we are such a large market that if we establish our own standards, everyone who wants to sell into China has to comply with our standards, which benefits us economically in a variety of other ways. And I took a lot of trips to Beijing and explained to them that I thought that was wrong, that it was actually in all of our interests that they not do that, and that in fact it would benefit all of us, China, the United States, Europe, and everyone else in the world, if China got more active in international standards. Now, I'm not suggesting they did it because I went to Beijing and said anything, but they clearly made a decision that that was in fact the way to go. And so now, ironically, standards organizations in sort of telecoms area and related are flooded with Chinese experts with great technologies and a variety of other things, and really dominate in many respects the international standards organizations, like at the ITU and elsewhere. And so they have been very effective at advocating international standards. Now, we've all benefited. I think there's some concern that that may have gone too far for a variety of reasons, and that other countries and other economies need to get much more actively involved in that. And particularly as we develop further 5G and 6G, that becomes, there's a political aspect to that that's also very important, as well as the economic. So that'll be key going forward. So I do think that piece of the puzzle will be very important. In answer to the question of globalization, again, nobody knows the answer, so it's all a guess. We've seen this movie at least twice. We had Globalization at the end of the century up until World War I. It then was a long period of time. It was from the end of World War I, really, actually the beginning, I should say, of World War I until somewhat after the end of World War II, when globalization really started to happen. And ultimately, what really took off was around the late 70s, early 80s. And that was, and I think this may be part of the answer, it was new innovative technologies that really drove globalization. It was innovations like telephony and the rise of the internet so that people could communicate instantaneously at low cost, that allowed for supply chains to be done truly globally. It was major developments in marine transport. So you had these huge container ships with containers that lowered dramatically the price and the cost, I should say, of shipping across the world. You had the rise of commercial aviation, same sort of thing. These were all sort of unthinkable up, before they really happened. And those types of things, and there are many others, of course, as well, that really drove globalization. So if I were to guess, I would say it would be a combination. I think globalization will continue to be with us because the economics and the political and the social benefits are so substantial of having some interconnection. It just may not be quite as hyper as it's been over the past couple of years, but it'll re-emerge, I think, as the economies start to realize that the benefits of having a globalized world outweigh the risks and the problems of having that globalization, which probably means having both globalization and perhaps more robust domestic manufacturing and the like. They're not at all mutually exclusive.
Yep. Let me ask you the final question. This is from Bessie Chu. Another very interesting question here. What are ways for countries to hold tech companies who may be bad actors accountable without heavy-handed and often ham-handed approaches such as antitrust? And let me just expand on that, and maybe to get your view. Are we basically having to create all these policies over these few bad actors, whether that be, discussions today about Meta in the US, maybe it's Jack Ma at Alibaba, that there's behaviors of certain individuals, but it doesn't say that the whole sector is bad. Are we running the risk here? We're kind of punishing the whole sector and should really go after individuals.
Yeah, my sense is, and there are always potentially and probably are, bad actors in terms of the companies, but that's actually pretty easy to deal with, I think. You have laws that sort of say you define what the bad actor is doing that is bad, and then you prohibit it, and then you take action to do that. That's the way in which we do with lots of bad actors and lots of situations in society. There's nothing unique about tech about that. And even the international aspect of it is not very unique about it. So my sense is that many, I'm not trying to defend the tech companies so much as I think what's happening is that it's a lot of people misusing the tech platforms and tech companies, so that it's bad individuals more than it is bad, parts of the economy. Now, that's not to say that companies can't and shouldn't and aren't trying to do more to harden their platforms, either with technology or individuals or a wide variety of mechanisms. And I think they would all say there's always room for improvement. There's no doubt about that. But my sense is most of the problems we're talking about, the societal problems, are people or sometimes nation states even, which is a different set of problems, using the platforms for nefarious reasons, fraud, socially disruptive behavior, and so forth. And that's a whole different problem. That's bad people acting badly rather than the companies themselves doing it. I think ultimately a lot of this, we have to learn, and by we, I mean everybody, and I realize this is not possible, in terms of uniformity, but we have to, as societies, get much better at being critical thinkers. And just because you see something on the internet doesn't mean it's real. Just because somebody tells you something doesn't mean it's right or real. You should always be questioning does that make sense? Does that really comport with what I see and feel? And one of the great advantages of the internet and these platforms is you have access, generally speaking, to a lot of information. I realize there are places and times where that may not be true, but by and large, you have access. So check things. There are lots of ways of sort of saying, is that really true? Part of the problem, and everybody does this, and it's very human, is everyone reposts, retweets, sends on things that look really scandalous and turns out not to be true. And that creates part of the problem. So some of this is bad actors being act, and some of the problem is just people being people.
Yep. Excellent. So Ambassador, let me do this. I like to always end the sessions sharing my so what's, my takeaways. I want to share those. I'm going to give you a chance to upgrade them or any parting comments that you've got. So I want to start out with the context of, number one, we're seeing fairly dramatic, rapid changes in public policy, certainly in the last year. The drivers of that have been, number one, just broader adoption of technology, which makes it more visible to everybody. But we've also seen an environment where globalization is under question, and that's driven some of it. And to your point you just made a minute ago, individual kind of lack of critical thinking, good use of technology, et cetera, that all has kind of contributed to this growing mantra and drumbeat for changes in public policy. Second point is when you look across that 3x3 matrix, so again, US, Europe, China, and then you look at data privacy, antitrust, and social networks, you see very different starting points and premises when you're going after these issues. In Europe, you talked about Europe has a fundamental view that data is a human right. It's a very kind of strong, strident position, et cetera. The US has had a more fragmented, laissez-faire approach. And in China, they have a fundamental view that the government should have access to data, which is different than the other regions. Very different premises across all of them. In the antitrust area, you have different definitions of what you're trying to go after. In Europe, they're looking just specifically at the number of competitors, who you're competing with. The US has had more of, well, prove it to me that consumers have been harmed. In the absence of that, it's all an academic discussion. And in China, you've seen very rapid action on addressing this. And then again, in the social network area, you've seen very different actions there. In China, in areas like gaming, you've seen very strong view that says, listen, we have to protect people. And then you see, in the US, a lot of rancor and people upset, but not easy to change due to the constitutional right for freedom of speech. So very different premises, and you resisted my attempt at getting you to give a first place ranking to each region of the world with a different policy. Next major point that I got is, as you're talking about policy changes, remember the unintended consequences. So in the area of data privacy, as an example, you talked about we could really stifle innovation, which creates an even bigger problem if we're not thoughtful, if we're using a sledgehammer to correct some of these ills. You also mentioned an interesting view about that we need to have a view that everything is local. This is a little bit of the hesitation again of kind of giving everybody a first place rating and saying, let's import all these best ideas. The contexts are so different in each area that it requires a different policy position. And we have to kind of live with the fact that there's going to be pretty notable differences from region to region. The last point, and it sounds a little bit like a contradiction, but it's a nuance instead of a contradiction, is, your view is we still need globalization, notwithstanding we've agreed to disagree on 18 different things, that we need to find the things that are going to jointly serve us well and let that be the mantra. And in all cases, standards help globally. All these things help. And so let's not get categorical in this local view and this view that we have differences. A little bit what Jennifer Zhu Scott said, that, we need to also respect differences and find the common interests. And then the final point I took away from you is, remember, we as individuals need to be responsible in our use of technology. If we can do that, we've come a long, long ways. So let me stop on those. Is that a fair summary of your key points?
I think you've done a masterful job. I should have taken lots of notes on that. No, I think that was exactly right. I'd say, I may have said, I think in terms of the Europeans, it's really privacy is the human rights rather than data itself, but that's a quibble. I think the keys here are, the pace of change, looking ahead, my sense, and I think everybody's sense is the pace of change of technology, change of regulations is going to continue to accelerate. So it isn't going to go back to the days where people had a lot of time to think about these things. It's going to continue. I think the key here is, as you point out, not one size fits all, but we should all learn from each other. There's a lot of learning globally, and including from very unexpected sources that we all can benefit from as we all experiment to try to figure out what works and what doesn't work. And ultimately, I'm hugely positive in this area. I really think, the impact technology writ large has had on helping the people of the world is second to none. In the past, in my lifetime, the changes that have happened globally are nothing less than radical and revolutionary. The ability to go places, the ability for literally billions of people to get out of dire poverty, the ability of people to have access to the world's information, the ability of people to have access to healthcare, the ability of people to understand what is happening elsewhere in the world, good or for bad, is revolutionary and is extraordinary. And that we need to make sure that that is able to continue and to improve. And even though we're all different and we have different ways of going about it, we should not and cannot lose sight of the extraordinary advantages. And one last plug for globalization, and I realize that it's a two-edged sword, is that the technologies and the benefits I just described are part and parcel of the benefits that come from globalization. The ability of people to get access to what it is they need to have their lives be better, whether it's jobs, whether it's goods, whether it's services. These are really important. And the globalization is a key factor. One last thought on that is we're seeing a rise in inflation globally. My view as a non-practicing economist is that that may well be a function of the less globalization we've been seeing for the past couple of years finally coming home to roost. That globalization and new technologies has driven the deflationary and the lack of inflation we've had for the past, really since through the 90s to today, from the 1980s. And that's been extraordinarily important and powerful for all the economies of the world. Inflation is a pernicious problem, and globalization is part of how you solve that, in my view.
Excellent. Listen, Ambassador Gross, let me just say a huge thank you. I mean, in a short period of time, you took one of the most complex areas broadly of technology, an area of public policy that is having profound impact on companies, on individuals, on societies, and you really boiled it down in a way that we could understand all of the key issues. So let me just say a huge thank you. It's clear why you've gotten all the great roles you have in your career, and a big thank you to the UCLA community for what you've done for us. We appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure. Look forward to seeing you again sometime soon. And I just wish we could all just do this in person, although Zoom works really, really well. Great technology.
It does. The beauty of technology. A big thank you. And for the audience, we're going to come back in 5 minutes, 5-minute break, and look forward to seeing you for our next session on local public policy. Thank you.